May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and redeemer. Before coming to Utah, I worked for a company in Chicago called Sargent Mundy. It was an engineering consulting firm, and I was in the nuclear licensing, maybe it was nuclear safety and licensing division. And I had an office mate. There was a lot of interesting people there at that company. And this fellow had been in the nuclear Navy. Actually, he had been on a submarine. He was a graduate of Annapolis, which is the equivalent of West Point in the Army. And he had some interesting stories to tell me. And one of my favorite stories concerned Admiral Rickover. Before he retired, Admiral Rickover was a 4-star admiral. He was considered by many to be the father of the nuclear navy. And he had this thing where he wanted to interview everybody that served on one of his submarines. Now, that would be a lot of people. Maybe it was every officer that served on a submarine. And some of these interviews were quite interesting. I suspect Jimmy Carter probably had to go through an interview. But it's interesting later as when Jimmy Carter became president, he became Rickover's boss. This one story really amazes me. The way this story goes, and I suspect it's true, is there was a young officer, came in, sat down in front of Rickover's desk, and they were having a conversation, and the fellow said, "I read a book every week." And Rickover was impressed. And he said, well, give me a few titles. And he said, it's TV Guide. Comes once a week. And Rickover said, okay, you can go stand in the closet. And the way this story goes is that officer stood in the closet for an hour. So it kind of shows you the kind of guy that Rickover was. I get the impression that he was kind of a short guy, kind of a wiry guy, but really kind of a tough-minded guy. He liked to get to the bottom of things. Earlier in the nuclear Navy program, and even trying to figure out whether this idea would work with having nuclear reactors on a submarine, they went to a lot of meetings, a lot of courses. Rickover was no slouch. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering. And during a lot of these talks, he would have a lot of questions. And he would raise his hand once and ask a question. He'd raise his hand twice, again and again. And then he looked around the room. And nobody else was asking questions. And finally, he became very frustrated, and he said, "You mean I'm the only dummy in this room that I've got to ask questions?" Kind of reminds me of the situation here with Thomas and Philip. Our story kind of picks up towards the end of the Last Supper. It was a matter of life and death. Maybe at that point, the disciples didn't realize it, but they probably had an inkling of it. You know, the Last Supper was kind of a celebration of the Passover. It was a peaceful setting. They probably felt secure. There was no Roman soldiers in the room. And yet they had an inkling that something foreboding was coming, because they knew that if they went to Jerusalem again, probably Jesus would be killed, or at least he was threatened to be killed. And Jesus says to them, somebody in this room will betray me. And then Peter, of course, if you go back to the end of chapter 13, Peter says, well, I'll defend you to the end of my life, Lord. And we all know how that went. And so finally, Thomas and Philip ask some questions after Jesus tries to comfort them. Jesus says, well, I'm going to a place where I prepare a room for you. And Thomas wants to know the way, or at least where Jesus is going. And Jesus says, don't you know? I'm the way. And I have to go so that I will be with God. And it kind of says, the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. And Philip says, well, show us the Father. And Jesus says, in so many words, you're looking at him. And I kind of often think of this as Jesus sort of being the presentation of the Father in a form that we can understand. In any case, it's bordering on a matter of life and death. And so Jesus kind of goes on. Actually, he goes on later in chapter 14 to talk about some other things. And even after chapter 15 and so on, he says quite a bit before getting to the Garden of Gethsemane. The book of John kind of gets into more of the theology of our Christian religion. There are supposed to be 7 signs, which are signs of miraculous evidence that Jesus is the Son of God in the book of John. And I'm kind of interested in how John uses this word signs. A lot of times we maybe talk about miracles, and that's probably what John is referring to, signs. Miracles have been defined as many things. Some people say it's a way to get our attention. Other people say it's a way of establishing Jesus' credit. And John uses it sort of as a sign that Jesus is pointing to himself as the Son of God. It's kind of like that signpost up ahead. It says the Son of God. And John also talks about 7 I ams in the book of John. And they are interesting. And they probably not are quite the same thing as the signs, because they don't all involve miracles. Some of them involve general discussions. Some of them involve parables. One of the first is, I am the bread of life. And that's in chapter 6, when Jesus feeds 5,000, starting with just a few barley loaves. I am the light of the world, which is in chapter 8 and 9. And in chapter 9, it involves a blind man being cured. I am a gate for the sheep. That's in chapter 10. And also in chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. It's the same parable. In chapter 5 or chapter 15, Jesus says, I am the true vine. And then in chapter 11, at the death of Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And finally, in today's chapter 14, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, as he responds to Philip's question. And these are all kind of like themes on the great I am, where Moses had talked to God. Who are you? And God said, I am who I am. Go tell the Hebrews, I am who I am has sent you. And if you look at it, it's not I am like the bread of life. It's not like I am the light of the world. It's not like I am like the way. It says, I am the way. And if you read chapter 14, it says, I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. You might ask, well, is this fair? Well, I don't know if it's fair or not. God is the author of the universe. That's the way it is. I'm kind of interested in what the physicists always have to say. And it's not just Philip that, wants to see God face to face. The physicists have kind of wanted to see God also. If you go back and look at the Higgs boson, which I can't remember his first name, but Professor Higgs hypothesized it in the 1970s. Took 40 years to find the Higgs boson. They had to build a huge what was it called? The Large Hadron Collider in Europe. You know, the U.S. wanted to build one, and we said it was too expensive. So, anyways, they found the Higgs boson about 1 or 2 years ago. Maybe it was a year ago. And Higgs got the Nobel Prize for that. But even Higgs, it was either Higgs or a friend of Higgs said, you know, I think too much emphasis has maybe been put on this. You know, it was for like 40 years, people kind of were saying, where is this Higgs boson? And maybe they were directing that to Higgs, and he felt like he was under a lot of pressure. And that's not the only instance where physicists or scientists have tried to look for God. Quite often, if you read about the cosmic microwave background, they say that's the face of God. All these ideas kind of point to maybe the Big Bang, okay, and how the universe was started. As some physicists have said, just because someone has an understanding of the physical world, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand spiritual matters. That's pretty wise for a physicist to say that. Not all physicists say that. Some physicists will say, oh, we've got this universe figured out. And so since we've got it figured out, we'll tell you that you don't really need God to run it. Not everyone believes that. I kind of look for ways to rationalize things. Some of you may have heard me talk about the eclipse of the moon around Easter. I find that one fascinating. But the thing that is probably most fascinating is the Bible itself, especially chapters like 14 and the chapters that follow. There were people there that witnessed to what Jesus did and what Jesus did. And in the human experience, you know, laboratory experiments, kind of like trial and error, a hypothesis, prove a hypothesis, but there's only so much you can do under controlled events. I've said this before, one of the most important things for finding the truth is the process of using witnesses. And the Gospels are probably one of the best witnesses we have. Carl Sagan, and I don't think I'll go through and say which physicist is a firm believer and which is not, but Carl Sagan has said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Well, you could see where that could be blockage. And Jesus knows that this is the case. If you kind of look at what he says to Philip, he says, in so many words, Jesus says, hey, I know this is hard to understand. This is incredible that a man is standing before you. As Paul says, Jesus was fully man, fully God. Jesus knows that this is hard for Philip to swallow. And so he says, if you find this hard to believe, at least look at the miracles themselves. Look at the evidence of the miracles. And it's interesting, because that was good for them, because they were there. But we aren't. But Thomas was there later. And Thomas was demanding proof too. He wanted to put his hands in Jesus' wounds. And he did. Well, he was offered the chance. He probably declined. But then Thomas said, yes, my Lord and my Savior. And Thomas, well, and then Jesus said to him, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And that was a good message for Thomas, but it was also a good message for us. The one biggest comfort in all of this today, in today's reading, is that Jesus has gone to heaven to find a room for us. And there's going to be many, many rooms beyond our imagination. And that's what sparked this whole conversation. But that is probably the biggest comfort for us in today's reading. Thanks be to God, and amen.